The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital in Baltimore hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Martinez adjusted her scrubs and checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. 3 hours left on her shift, and the emergency department was mercifully quiet for a Friday night. The coffee maker gurgled in the break room, competing with the distant beep of monitors and the occasional shuffle of feet on linoleum floors. Sarah had been a trauma nurse for 8 years, ever since graduating from Johns Hopkins. She'd seen everything Baltimore's streets could throw at her: gunshot wounds, overdoses, car accidents that defied physics. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made her neck hairs stand on end. "Martinez, you've got incoming," called Dr. Rodriguez from behind the reception desk. "Ambulance ETA 2 minutes. Multiple GSWs, priority 1. Sarah nodded, muscle memory kicking in. She grabbed fresh gloves from the dispenser and headed to Trauma Bay 3, her Nike sneakers squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Through the automatic doors, she could already hear the sirens cutting through Baltimore's night symphony of traffic and distant music from the inner harbor bars. The ambulance doors burst open with a metallic clang. 2 paramedics wheeled in a stretcher, carrying a middle-aged black man in an expensive suit, now soaked crimson. Sarah's trained eye immediately catalogued the damage: 2 entry wounds, one in the shoulder, another dangerously close to his heart. "What have we got?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "Marcus Williams, age 42, 2 GSWs to the torso. Lost consciousness twice en route, BP dropping fast, possible cardiac involvement." Sarah began cutting away the man's shirt, her scissors moving with precision. As the fabric fell away, something caught her eye: a small tattoo on his collarbone. Not the usual gang marking or personal art she'd seen countless times. This was different. A small eagle clutching an olive branch, unmistakably government. "Get me 2 units of O-neg, stat!" Dr. Rodriguez barked. "Sarah, start a second IV line." As Sarah worked, inserting the needle with steady hands despite the chaos, she noticed something else. The man's wallet had fallen from his jacket pocket. A corner of plastic peeked out. Not a driver's license, but something with a government seal. Her heart rate quickened. The trauma bay filled with controlled urgency. Machines beeped warnings, nurses called out vital signs, and Dr. Rodriguez worked with the focused intensity that had made him legendary in Baltimore's medical community. Sarah found herself studying the patient's face as she monitored his vitals. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him. "We're losing him," Dr. Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "Pressure's dropping. Sarah, push another epi." Sarah's hands moved automatically, years of training overriding the strange unease settling in her stomach. As she administered the medication, the patient's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. In that brief instant, his gaze locked with hers, and he whispered something so quietly she almost missed it. "Operation Nightingale." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She'd heard that name before, somewhere in the deep recesses of her memory. But before she could process it further, alarms began shrieking. The man was coding. "All right, people, let's bring him back," Dr. Rodriguez said, reaching for the defibrillator paddles. "D clear." Sarah stepped back as electricity coursed through the patient's body, his back arching off the gurney. The heart monitor showed flatline for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly jumped back to life with a steady rhythm. "That's what I'm talking about," Dr. Rodriguez said with satisfaction. "Nice work, everyone. Sarah, let's get him stabilized and up to OR." As the team prepared to transfer Marcus Williams to surgery, Sarah noticed 2 men in dark suits entering the trauma bay. They moved with the purposeful stride of federal agents, their eyes scanning the room with professional assessment. The taller one, a man with graying temples and the build of a former military officer, approached Dr. Rodriguez. "Dr. Rodriguez, Agent Harrison, FBI, we need to speak with you about your patient." Sarah felt her blood run cold. FBI agents didn't show up at hospitals unless something serious was happening. She tried to focus on her post-trauma cleanup, but her ears strained to catch fragments of the hushed conversation between the doctor and the agents. Classified matter, national security, need complete discretion. The shorter agent, a woman with sharp features and calculating eyes, noticed Sarah listening. Their gazes met across the trauma bay, and Sarah quickly looked away, but not before she caught the woman making a note in a small black book. "Nurse Martinez," Dr. Rodriguez called out, using a tone Sarah had never heard from him before, formal, almost warning. "Could you please finish Mr. Williams' paperwork? Agent Harrison here says there are some special considerations for his case." Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. As she walked to the nurse's station, she felt the female agent's eyes following her every step. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled up the patient file on the computer terminal. The screen showed basic information. Marcus Williams, no known address, no emergency contact, no insurance information. But there was an addendum at the bottom of the file that made her heart skip a beat. Refer all inquiries to DOD Liaison Office, Department of Defense. Whatever Marcus Williams was involved in, it was bigger than a simple shooting in Baltimore. Sarah's mind raced back to his whispered words, Operation Nightingale. As she typed up her nursing notes, trying to keep her entries routine and clinical, Sarah became aware of someone standing behind her. She turned to find Agent Harrison studying her with intense grey eyes. "Ms. Martinez," he said quietly, "I'm going to need you to come with us for a brief conversation. Nothing formal, just some questions about your patient's condition when he arrived." Sarah's training told her to comply with law enforcement, but every instinct screamed that this was far from routine. "I've already documented everything in his chart. Standard trauma protocol." "I'm sure you have," Agent Harrison replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But there are aspects of Mr. Williams' case that require additional discretion. National security implications." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sarah looked around the trauma bay, hoping Dr. Rodriguez might intervene, but he was conspicuously absent. The other nurses were busy with routine tasks, seemingly oblivious to the federal agents now surrounding her workstation. "Am I under arrest?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Of course not," the female agent interjected smoothly. "Now we just need to ensure that certain information doesn't circulate inappropriately. You understand?" Sarah understood perfectly. Whatever she had witnessed tonight, whatever Marcus Williams had whispered to her in his moment of delirium, the government wanted it contained. As Agent Harrison gestured toward the exit, Sarah realized her quiet life as a trauma nurse in Baltimore had just taken a very dangerous turn. The automatic doors slid shut behind them with a soft hiss, and Sarah Martinez disappeared into the night, leaving behind the familiar comfort of beeping monitors and fluorescent lights for a world she never knew existed. The black SUV moved through Baltimore's empty streets like a shadow, its tinted windows reflecting the orange glow of streetlights. Sarah sat in the back seat between the two agents, her scrubs still bearing traces of Marcus Williams' blood, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask aloud. "Where are we going?" she finally ventured as they turned onto Interstate 95, heading north toward the glowing dome of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Agent Harrison glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Somewhere secure where we can talk properly. Don't worry, Ms. Martinez, you're not in trouble." Quite the opposite, actually. The cryptic response did nothing to calm Sarah's nerves. She studied the passing landscape, industrial buildings giving way to suburban sprawl, then the familiar monuments of the nation's capital emerging from the darkness. Her phone had been confiscated during the ride, along with her hospital ID badge, for security purposes, they'd explained. 20 minutes later, they pulled into an underground garage beneath a nondescript office building in Foggy Bottom. Sarah had lived in the D.C. area long enough to recognize the neighborhood, home to the State Department, George Washington University, and dozens of government contractors whose actual business remained deliberately vague. The elevator rose silently to the 15th floor, opening onto a corridor that could have belonged to any corporate office, except for the subtle security cameras and the fact that none of the doors had names or numbers, just small electronic keypads. Agent Harrison led her to a conference room with a view of the Potomac River. Despite the late hour, the room was prepared for their arrival. Coffee, water, and a stack of documents with classified stamps in red ink across every page. "And please sit," the female agent said, introducing herself for the first time. "I'm Agent Chen, by the way, and before we begin, I need you to understand something very important. Nothing we discuss tonight can ever be repeated. Not to family, not to friends, not to your hospital colleagues. Are we clear?" Sarah nodded, though her mouth felt like cotton. "What's this about? Who was that man I treated tonight?" Agent Harrison settled into a chair across from her, his demeanor shifting from intimidating to almost paternal. "Marcus Williams was one of our deep-cover operatives. For the past 3 years, he's been embedded in a human trafficking network operating between Eastern Europe and major American cities. Tonight, his cover was blown." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Human trafficking. She'd seen the aftermath. Young women and girls brought to St. Mary's emergency room with injuries that told stories too horrific to fully comprehend. The idea that someone was actively working to stop it made her feel slightly less sick about the world. "But what does this have to do with me?" Sarah asked. Agent Chen opened one of the classified folders. 3 years ago, you treated a young woman named Elena Volkov. She'd been beaten, drugged, held captive for weeks. Do you remember her?" Sarah's breath caught. She remembered Elena vividly, a 19-year-old Ukrainian girl with haunted eyes and cigarette burns on her arms. Sarah had worked the night shift when Elena was brought in by police after a raid on a suspected brothel in East Baltimore. "I remember," Sarah said quietly. "Elena survived because of the care you provided," Agent Harrison continued. "More importantly, she remembered your kindness. When our operative, Marcus Williams, gained her trust months later, she specifically mentioned a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital who had treated her with dignity when everyone else saw her as just another statistic." Agent Chen slid a photograph across the table. It showed Elena, but different, healthier, smiling, wearing business attire. "Elena is now working with us. She's become one of our most valuable assets in identifying trafficking networks. And she's specifically requested that you be brought into Operation Nightingale." Sarah stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. "I don't understand. I'm just a nurse. I treat injuries, I follow protocols. I'm not qualified for whatever this is." "You're more qualified than you realize," Agent Harrison said, leaning forward. "Human trafficking operations depend on medical care for their victims. They can't risk taking seriously injured girls to regular hospitals. Too many questions, too much documentation. So they use underground networks, corrupt medical professionals, anyone who will patch up their merchandise without asking questions." The clinical language made Sarah's stomach turn, but she began to see where this was heading. Agent Chen opened another folder, revealing surveillance photos of a medical clinic in Queens, New York. "This is Dr. Yuri Petrov's practice. On the surface, he runs a legitimate family medicine clinic, serving Russian and Ukrainian immigrants. In reality, he's the primary medical contact for 3 major trafficking rings on the East Coast. We've been trying to get an operative inside Petrov's circle for 18 months, Agent Harrison explained. Every healthcare professional we've approached has either refused or been exposed before making meaningful contact. We need someone with genuine medical credentials, someone who can believably present themselves as willing to work off the books for the right price." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. "You want me to go undercover?" "We want you to save lives," Agent Chen corrected. Elena identified at least 40 girls currently being held in safe houses across New York and New Jersey. These aren't numbers in a file. They're daughters, sisters, young women whose families back home think they're working legitimate jobs in America. Agent Harrison slid a tablet across the table, showing a video feed. Sarah recognized Eleanor immediately, though she looked different in the grainy security footage. Nervous, glancing over her shoulder as she walked through what appeared to be a hotel corridor. "This was taken yesterday," Agent Chen explained. "Elena reported that Dr. Petrov is looking for a new nurse, someone qualified but desperate enough to work without asking questions. The perfect cover for someone with your background and skills." Sarah watched the video, remembering the young woman she'd treated 3 years ago, broken, traumatized, speaking in whispered Ukrainian between sobs. The transformation was remarkable, but Sarah could still see the wariness in Elena's eyes, the hypervigilance of someone who'd survived hell. "If I do this," Sarah said slowly, "what happens to my job at St. Mary's? My life in Baltimore?" "Officially, you'll be taking a sabbatical to care for a sick relative," Agent Harrison replied. "Your position will be held, your benefits maintained. This operation should last no more than 6 weeks. And unofficially?" Agent Chen's expression grew serious. "Unofficially, if you're discovered, the US government will disavow any knowledge of your activities. You'll be completely on your own." The weight of the decision settled on Sarah's shoulders like lead. She thought about her comfortable routine at St. Mary's, her small apartment in Federal Hill, her weekly phone calls with her mother in San Antonio, a normal life that suddenly felt incredibly precious. But she also thought about Elena and the 40 other girls whose names she didn't know, whose faces she'd never seen, whose stories might end very differently depending on the choice she made in this sterile conference room overlooking the Potomac River. "When would I start?" Sarah asked. Agent Harrison and Agent Chen exchanged a look of satisfaction. "Monday morning," Agent Harrison said. "Elena has already made contact with Dr. Petrov's office. You have an interview scheduled for 9 a.m. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the coffee cup. 4 days to completely reinvent herself, to become someone willing to collaborate with monsters for the chance to save their victims. 4 days to prepare for a role that could save lives or get her killed. "There's one more thing," Agent Chen said, sliding a final document across the table. "If this operation is successful, if we can use your access to gather enough intelligence to shut down these networks permanently, you'll have the gratitude of the highest levels of government, the very highest levels." The implication was clear, though Sarah barely dared to process it. As she signed her name to forms she barely read, agreeing to terms she barely understood, Sarah Martinez began her transformation from trauma nurse to undercover operative in a war most Americans never knew was being fought on their own streets. The Queen's Medical Center occupied a narrow building wedged between a Russian grocery store and a check-cashing business, its faded brick facade and peeling paint perfectly camouflaging its true purpose. Sarah stood across the street, adjusting the cheap blazer she'd bought at a Goodwill in Alexandria, trying to channel the desperation Agent Chen had coached her to project. Her transformation had been thorough. Gone were her neat hospital scrubs and comfortable sneakers, replaced by worn clothing and scuffed shoes that suggested financial hardship. Her hair, usually pulled back in a professional ponytail, now hung loose and slightly unkempt. Most importantly, her story had been carefully constructed. Sarah Martinez, former nurse at a private clinic in Virginia, fired for stealing prescription medications, now desperate for work and willing to keep her mouth shut for the right salary. "Remember," Agent Chen's voice crackled through the nearly invisible earpiece, "Petrov will test your desperation. He needs to believe you're completely compromised before he'll trust you with the real work." Sarah crossed the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and fear, a combination she recognized from her legitimate medical work, but here it felt more sinister. 3 women sat in mismatched chairs, all appearing to be Eastern European immigrants, their eyes downcast and voices hushed when they spoke at all. "You are Sarah Martinez." The receptionist's English carried a heavy Russian accent. She was younger than Sarah expected, maybe early 20s, with the hollow cheeks and nervous energy of someone who'd seen too much too soon. "Yes, I have an appointment with Dr. Petrov. The receptionist studied Sarah with calculating eyes, taking in every detail from her scuffed shoes to her slightly trembling hands. Doctor is with patient. You wait. Sarah sat in a plastic chair that had seen better decades, trying to appear anxious without overacting. Through the thin walls, she could hear muffled voices speaking in Russian, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like crying. Every maternal instinct she'd developed as a trauma nurse screamed at her to investigate, but her training kept her seated and silent. 20 minutes later, Dr. Yuri Petrov emerged from the back office. He was shorter than Sarah had expected from the surveillance photos, with thinning grey hair and soft hands that somehow managed to look menacing despite their manicured appearance. His smile was practiced but never reached his eyes. Ms. Martinez, yes? Please, come to my office. The office was a study in contradictions, expensive leather furniture mixed with outdated medical equipment, framed diplomas from prestigious medical schools, hanging beside photographs that appeared to show Petrov with various Eastern European men in expensive suits. Sarah's trained eye immediately catalogued the medical supplies visible through an open cabinet door. Powerful sedatives, antibiotics, and surgical equipment that seemed far beyond what a family practice would typically require. So, Petrov said, settling behind his desk like a spider in its web, you need work, yes? But you have problems with your previous employment? Sarah let her voice carry a note of defensive embarrassment. I made mistakes. I was going through a difficult time, divorce, financial pressure. I took some medications from inventory to sell. They caught me. Ah, yes, money problems make people do stupid things. Petrov's English was accented but precise. But sometimes stupid people can be very useful if they learn to be smart about being stupid, you understand? I understand I need this job, Sarah replied, allowing desperation to color her tone. I have medical loans, credit card debt. I can't afford to be picky about employment conditions. Petrov nodded approvingly. Good. Honesty about desperation is valuable quality. Now this position requires flexibility. Some patients come at unusual hours. Some treatments are private. Family matters, you understand. Immigration issues. People who prefer not to have official records. Sarah felt her stomach clench but nodded. I understand medical confidentiality. Excellent. One more question. You have problem with blood, with injuries that might not be typical accident injuries? The question hung in the air like a trap. Sarah forced herself to meet Petrov's gaze directly. I worked trauma at a hospital in Virginia. I've seen everything. Good, good. Petrov opened a desk drawer and pulled out a stack of cash. More money than Sarah made in 2 weeks at St. Mary's. This is advance on salary. You start tonight. Midnight shift. Very simple work. My assistant Anya will show you procedures. Sarah pocketed the money, trying to project gratitude while fighting nausea. Tonight. We have several patients arriving from out of state. Travel injuries, you understand? Nothing serious, just need professional medical attention without bureaucratic complications. As if summoned by his words, the young receptionist appeared in the doorway. Doctor, they are here. Petrov's demeanor shifted immediately, all pretense of pleasantry vanishing. Anya, take Ms. Martinez to supply room. Show her equipment layout. Then she can observe tonight's procedures. Anya led Sarah through a maze of corridors that seemed to extend far deeper into the building than the narrow storefront suggested. The supply room was shockingly well equipped. IV drips, surgical instruments, even a portable ultrasound machine. You must understand rules, Anya said in accented English, her voice barely above a whisper. Patients do not speak English. You do not speak to them unless doctor says. You document nothing. You see nothing unusual. You remember nothing. How long have you worked here? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the young woman's story. Anya's eyes darted toward the door, fear flickering across her features. Long enough to know questions are dangerous. Before Sarah could respond, voices echoed from the front of the clinic. Men speaking in Russian, their tones urgent and commanding. Anya immediately straightened, her face becoming a mask of professional neutrality. They bring first patients now. You watch, you learn, you stay quiet. The next hour became a nightmare Sarah would never forget. 3 young women, none older than 20, were brought into the clinic's back rooms. Their injuries told stories Sarah's experienced eye could read like a horrific book. Defensive wounds, signs of prolonged physical restraint, malnutrition, and worse things she forced herself not to dwell on. Petrov worked with clinical efficiency, treating injuries just enough to ensure the girls remained functional, without addressing the underlying trauma or asking any questions about how they'd been hurt. Sarah forced herself to assist, handing him instruments, monitoring vital signs, all while memorizing every detail for her eventual report. The worst moment came when one of the girls, barely 18, with dark hair and eyes that reminded Sarah painfully of Elena, grabbed her wrist during an IV insertion and whispered in heavily accented English, "Please, it'd help." Sarah met the girl's desperate gaze for just a moment, trying to convey sympathy and hope without alerting Petrov to the exchange. But she saw the recognition in the girl's eyes, the understanding that even here, surrounded by monsters, there might be one person who still saw her as human. "Concentrate on your work," Petrov said sharply, though Sarah wasn't sure if he'd witnessed the brief interaction. "Emotional involvement makes bad medicine." By 3 a.m., the last patient had been treated and taken away by the same men who'd brought them. Sarah's scrubs, different from her hospital uniform but still painfully familiar, were stained with blood and tears she'd refused to shed in front of Petrov. "You did acceptable work tonight," Petrov said, as he locked away medical supplies. "Same time tomorrow. And Ms. Martinez, you understand importance of discretion, yes? These girls have complicated situations, family problems, legal issues. We provide medical help without making their problems worse with official attention." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. As she walked to her car in the pre-dawn darkness, Agent Chen's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Outstanding work. We got everything on audio. Elena identified 2 of the girls from your descriptions. We know where they're being held." But Sarah barely heard the praise. All she could think about was the girl who'd grabbed her wrist, the desperate plea for help, and the horrible knowledge that she'd have to return tomorrow night and pretend to be complicit in this nightmare for weeks more before they could finally act to stop it. 3 weeks into her deep cover assignment, Sarah had documented enough evidence to destroy Dr. Petrov's operation 10 times over. The hidden camera in her medical bag had captured dozens of victims, recorded conversations revealing trafficking routes from Ukraine to New York, and identified key players in the network. But she'd also witnessed horrors that would haunt her forever. Tonight felt different. The tension in the clinic was palpable. Petrov was nervous, constantly checking his phone and speaking in rapid Russian with associates who looked more like soldiers than medical staff. Anya had whispered a warning earlier. "Big shipment coming. Very important people. Be extra careful." "Something's happening," Sarah murmured into her concealed microphone as she prepared medical supplies. "Petrov's expecting VIPs." Agent Chen's voice crackled in her earpiece. "We know. Elena intercepted communications about a major transport arriving from Eastern Europe. Stay alert and document everything, but don't take unnecessary risks." At exactly midnight, 3 black SUVs pulled up outside the clinic. Sarah watched from the supply room window as heavily armed men took positions around the building's perimeter. This wasn't routine. This was military-level security. The first person through the door made Sarah's blood freeze. It was a man she recognized from FBI wanted posters. Viktor Kozlov, one of the most notorious human traffickers in the world, responsible for moving thousands of women and children across international borders. His presence here meant tonight's operation was far more significant than the routine medical care she'd been providing. "Martinez," Petrov called out, his voice tight with stress. "Come quickly. We have multiple patients requiring immediate attention." Sarah entered the main treatment room to find a scene from her worst nightmares. 8 young women, all appearing to be teenagers, sat chained together on a bench. They were severely dehydrated, showing signs of drug withdrawal, and several bore fresh injuries from violent handling. But their eyes, hollow, defeated, already dead inside, told the real story. These girls need full medical evaluation," Kozlov said in heavily accented English, studying Sarah with predatory interest. "They must be healthy for new positions in Chicago and Los Angeles. Very important clients waiting." Sarah's hands shook as she began triage, forcing herself to maintain professional composure while her heart shattered. The youngest girl couldn't be more than 15, with blonde hair and blue eyes that reminded Sarah of her own niece back in Texas. "This one is pregnant," Sarah announced after examining the third girl, hoping to protect her from whatever fate Kozlov had planned. Kozlov's face darkened. "How pregnant?" "Maybe 12 weeks. She needs proper prenatal care, not—" "She needs nothing," Kozlov interrupted coldly. "Handle it." Sarah understood immediately what he meant and felt bile rise in her throat. "I'm not qualified for that kind of procedure. She needs to go to a proper medical facility." "You will handle it, or I will find someone less squeamish," Kozlov said, his hand moving to the gun in his waistband. "These are business assets, not people. You treat them like the products they are." In that moment, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing the charade, instead of gathering more evidence while more girls suffered, she activated the emergency signal Agent Chen had given her, a specific sequence of touches on her medical bag that would alert the tactical team waiting 3 blocks away. "I need to get some specialized equipment from the storage room," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady. But as she turned toward the door, Kozlov grabbed her arm with a grip that felt like a steel trap. "I think you misunderstand your position here, Nurse Martinez. No one leaves until all patients are processed." Sarah met his gaze directly, and in that moment dropped all pretense. "I understand my position perfectly, Victor. I also understand that in about 30 seconds, you're going to be surrounded by federal agents." The room erupted in chaos. Kozlov drew his weapon, but Sarah was already moving, years of trauma nursing having taught her to function under extreme pressure. She grabbed a surgical tray and hurled it at the clinic's main lights, plunging the room into darkness, just as the first flashbang grenades exploded through the windows. "FBI, everyone down!" The tactical assault was precision choreographed. Doors and windows exploded inward simultaneously. Armed agents flooded the clinic from multiple entry points, and within seconds, every trafficker in the building was face down on the floor with rifles pointed at their heads. Sarah found herself shielding the pregnant girl as gunfire erupted briefly from the back rooms where some of Petrov's men had tried to resist. Through the chaos, she heard Agent Chen's voice shouting commands, coordinating the arrest of what would later be described as the largest human trafficking bust in U.S. history. "Sarah! Sarah! Are you hit?" Agent Harrison was suddenly beside her, his face streaked with tactical paint, but his eyes full of genuine concern. "I'm fine," Sarah gasped, still protecting the girl beneath her. "But these women need immediate medical attention. Real medical attention." The aftermath moved with bureaucratic efficiency that contrasted sharply with the violence of the raid. Paramedics treated the trafficking victims, social workers began the delicate process of communication and trauma counseling, and federal agents began the massive task of processing evidence and arrests. Elena appeared in the clinic doorway, no longer the nervous operative from the surveillance videos, but a confident young woman in an FBI jacket, carrying herself with the authority of someone who'd helped orchestrate this entire operation. "You did it," Elena said to Sarah, her voice thick with emotion. "And all of them, every single girl here tonight, they're going home because of what you risked." Sarah watched paramedics carefully transport the pregnant teenager to a waiting ambulance, knowing that this girl would receive proper medical care, psychological support, and eventually, hopefully, a chance to rebuild her life. Multiply that by dozens of other victims they'd identified through the operation, and the scope of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. Ms. Martinez, Agent Chen approached with a secure phone in her hand. "There's someone who wants to speak with you." Sarah took the phone, exhausted and emotionally drained, expecting perhaps the FBI director or attorney general. Instead, a familiar voice came through the encrypted connection, one she'd heard countless times on television but never imagined would be speaking directly to her. "Nurse Martinez, this is President Williams. I want to personally thank you for your service to this country. What you've done, going undercover, risking your life to save these young women, represents the very best of American values." Sarah felt tears finally coming. 3 weeks of suppressed emotion breaking through her professional composure. "Thank you, Mr. President. I couldn't stand by and watch. Agent Chen tells me you've expressed interest in continuing this kind of work. The Federal Bureau of Investigation could use someone with your unique combination of medical expertise and operational courage. If you're interested, there's a position waiting for you at Quantico." Through the clinic windows, Sarah could see Baltimore's skyline in the distance, the familiar lights of St. Mary's Hospital, where her old life waited, comfortable, predictable, safe. But she also saw the ambulances carrying trafficking victims toward freedom, and she thought about Elena's transformation from broken victim to federal agent, and she realized that some opportunities to make a difference were too important to pass up. "I'm interested, Mr. President. Very interested." 6 months later, FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez would lead a multi-agency task force targeting international human trafficking, directly responsible for rescuing over 300 victims and dismantling trafficking networks across 3 continents. But that night, in a Queens medical clinic surrounded by broken glass and federal agents, she was still just a nurse who'd decided that some fights were worth risking everything.